Thank you, everyone, for joining this session today. Again, apologies for the slight delay on starting there. But welcome to techUK's first ever online panel on the Metaverse. For those of you who I am yet to meet, hello, my name is Laura Foster, and I am the Head of Programme for Tech and Innovation at techUK, techUK being the UK's Technology Trade Association. If after today's session you have any questions at all about the work that techUK does, or any of the work that we do around emerging technologies, which of course now includes the metaverse, please do not hesitate to reach out. This is also a really exciting session as it's the first in our new Future Vision series, where we are going to be exploring what is next for the UK tech sector and specifically explore topics around emerging and transformative tech that you want to hear. So we've got a really exciting lineup of panels and webinars coming out across the summer, but also please do get in contact if there's any topics that you specifically want to hear about. So before we get started, just a couple of quick house rules. If you are not a speaker, you shouldn't be able to have your camera or mic on, but if you do, please just make sure that your camera and mic is off. This will just help with the quality of the recording since this session is recorded and therefore on record. However, we want this to be as interactive as possible. You don't just want to hear from me the entire time, so please do use the chat function to ask any questions that you might have for the panelists today, and we can help bring them into the conversation. Okay, so why are we all here? Well, we all somewhat know that the metaverse may soon be a reality for UK businesses and consumers. However, recent hype around this concept and increasing investment in the development and deployment of the metaverse is raising several important questions, including how do we even define the metaverse and what this emerging technology may mean for the UK tech sector. So, in response to this, today's session, we have convened technology leaders who are dedicated to the development and deployment of this technology to answer these burning questions and understand what this new, complex, and exciting opportunity may mean. Just a couple of core themes to look out for throughout today's discussion. So, of course, we're going to be discussing what the promise of the metaverse is, but also keep in mind what has actually caused the emergence of the metaverse. And of course, there's a technology question there. So, how is tech enabling the creation of the metaverse? But also from a social and ethical perspective as well. What has led to the emergence of the metaverse? We will, of course, also be looking at the different metaverse models from consumer, enterprise, and industrial, and looking at the different technologies that might be powering them. So I think that is enough from me. So I am excited to now bring in the wonderful speakers that we have joining us here today. So I am joined here by Christopher Hay, who is a global IX CTO for IBM, by Jamie Allen, who is the media and entertainment industry lead for NVIDIA, by Sue McLean, who is a technology partner at Baker McKenzie, and Theo Priestley, who is the CEO at Metanomic. Thank you so much for all of you joining us here today.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Jamie. So I want to dive straight into the conversation, but please do take some time at the beginning of the first question to introduce yourself and the work that you do. So I want to start by maybe cutting through that hype with the first question and looking at some of these terms which are kind of easily thrown around when we start discussing the metaverse, but we're not entirely sure what they mean. So my first question has two parts. Firstly, what is the difference between a metaverse and the term Web 3.0, which we see used quite a lot when we talk about the metaverse? And two, even though our definitions of what the metaverse might be they might differ, but I'd love to hear what your specific definition of the metaverse is. Now, who should I pick on first? Theo, can I start with you? Theo, I think you might be on mute. I'm sorry.
Here we go. Sorry. Yeah, I always get picked on first, so. I think so. To me, the metaverse is essentially an extension of our physical lives across a network of virtual worlds. I think that's probably about the simplest way that I can boil it down. What we do on a day-to-day basis in our physical life, we can actually do virtually in many different worlds. I don't think the metaverse encompasses this. I don't think there is the metaverse. There will be many metaverses, and they can take whatever shape or form, like we'll discuss today, which is consumer-based, entertainment-based, industrial-based, business-based. So I think the metaverse can be shaped to whatever it is that we want it to be. In terms of Web3, I actually think, well, Web3 to me is an evolution of the current web. So it's very much, the current web is very much centralized, owned by central organizations. Web 3.0 is potentially will be built on a mix of centralized software and open source software and infrastructure owned by the people rather than the organizations themselves. So it's more driven by creator economies and creators owning parts of the web and the content that they create, and their ability to monetize that and their ability to protect the data that they have. So
Thanks, Theo. I think that was a perfect way to get us started on those two definitions. But I would love to bring some of the other speakers in. So Jamie, can I go to you next?
Sure, and I think Theo's explanation there was very, very good. The advantage that we have at NVIDIA right now is working with lots of different industries and understanding what their needs are for interconnected virtual worlds. And I think that is really how we see the definition, is interconnected 3D spaces. And the really important thing for me, and I think for many of the people we work with, is reducing the friction in moving between those spaces. And that could be a 3D content creation tool like an Autodesk application, and a BIM tool like a 360 app for architects. Or it could be moving between one gaming platform to another without needing to log into something else to change your avatars, to taking your digital self from one world to another without needing to make any changes. So that's really where we see the direction of those interconnected virtual worlds going.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of key themes that are being picked up across those two definitions. But Chris, can I go to you before we go to Sue to round up the definitions aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be really boring and sort of repeat what Theo and Jamie was saying. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, likewise, I think it's sort of the next generation of the internet, and that will allow us to kind of bridge between the physical, digital, and virtual world seamlessly. Now, from that perspective, what does that really mean from a business, right? Because a lot of the times we look at things from a gaming strategy, and the way I sort of see this going forward is if we think about this as an extension of businesses' omni-channel strategy, right? So we've had this sort of evolution where you went from the web to the mobile phone. You've got the physical in-store experience, the physical branch experience, the contact centers, and actually it's all about meeting people where they are, right? And if we look at what's happening now, people are moving into these virtual worlds, into the metaverse. We're seeing augmented reality very, very early just now, but that's obviously going to be much larger in the future. So bringing these physical and digital worlds together and making them be more seamless and represent yourselves across those worlds, I think is important. On the Web3 thing, I agree. Web3 and the metaverse are very connected, but very different at the same time. And but there's a lot of overlap there. And again, Web3 similar. Openness, decentralization, and kind of blockchain there. But where they're going to work really well together is about that interconnectivity and that interoperability and that ability to work between the different verses, etc., and bring forward that multi-channel strategy. So yeah, that's kind of where I am. But a little bit boring, as a bit of a repeat of what everyone else says.
Not boring at all, I promise you. And we're going to get into some of those topics in just a second. But Sue, any opening comments you want to make?
Yeah, I mean, I continuation, but I mean, I think for me, Web 3.0 still remains a pretty abstract concept for a lot of people. And obviously it's being used to refer to this future, more decentralized internet, which isn't controlled by these, relatively small number of major enterprises and run on the blockchain. But again, as we said, that's not entirely new. That's a continuation. We've been talking about blockchain and decentralized platforms for many years, but currently the biggest platforms that most of us use are centralized. And so there is a distinction between kind of what what we have now and what we're going to have in the future. And so when people are talking about the metaverse, or metaverses, to me at the moment, at least as a lawyer, where they're wanting to get into this space, they're really talking more about the experience and the kind of use cases that a metaverse type platform or platforms enable. And for me, I agree, it's more about the sense of an immersive digital platform, a sort of fully realized digital world that brings together the physical and the virtual. Because obviously, platforms like Teams are great. We have an ability to connect, but it's not 3D. I'm not in the room, unfortunately, with the three of you. In the future metaverse, could I be in a much more immersive experience? And likewise, that allows me to move in and out of different worlds potentially, if we can really achieve that interoperability. And so for me, there are two concepts. There is some connectivity between them, but ultimately a metaverse or a series of metaverse platforms, whatever we end up with in the future, they could be centralized, they could be decentralized, or I suspect we're likely to see a bit of both.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, definitely what we end up with in the future. It's certainly not something which is set in stone right now. But a couple of core themes that stood out between what everyone was saying there was the ability to move in and out of these different virtual worlds. And the way interoperability is going to be so key for the conversation there. Chris, I know this might be a bit of a simple question, but for our attendees, can you just explain why interoperability is going to be so key for the metaverse in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think the quick version of this is platforms or verses are going to come and go, right? We see that in the Web3 world, right? So you don't want to be in this position where you're invested in one platform dominates everything, right? So it's, and that's kind of back to this point about decentralization as well, right? Is this is meant to be for kind of everyone to be able to interrupt. So a good example of this, and this will probably open up the floodgates there, but I'm a big fan of sunglasses. So if I buy a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses or a pair of Oakleys, right, they're my particular favorite brands, then what I don't want to do is every time I go into a different platform, a different world, have to buy a new pair of Ray-Ban virtual sunglasses, right? I want to be able to take that pair of sunglasses with me from world to world, and I want that to be authenticated as a real pair of Ray-Bans that I've purchased. So that, in that sense, is important. But even if you just look at it very simply today, right? If you go into something like Horizon Workrooms or Decentraland, or if you go into VRChat, any one of these platforms, right? The first experience you have is like, oh, welcome to this platform. Can you please log in? Can you sign in? Can you configure an avatar? And then about 20 minutes later, I might get in and be able to play the game that I've got. And then I'm represented in each different platform. So that, in that sense, is from an interoperability, just that simple ability to take the virtual goods that you've got and be able to take your identity, your representation from platform to platform, is going to give you that sort of seamless experience. Now that's complicated and hard, and we'll get into a whole discussion about that. But that's really looking at it from a kind of user-driven perspective. And even then, to come back to the real world, this Teams meeting, right? That same avatar that represents me in the virtual world, I want to be able to bring into my business, sign-ins as well. So yeah, so it's super important.
I think that we take for granted now that Web 2.0 as a platform has global single sign-on capabilities from multiple different companies that allows you to take your digital profile, your payment information, your avatar image to nearly any website that wants to use those platforms. Now, I'm not saying that the particular companies who run those platforms are the right people to run the same thing in a metaverse. I think they're more likely to be the first people to do it because they already have the scale and the capability. But we know that that is what is needed in order to take your 3D representation and your blockchain payment information rather than your debit card information from one world to another. But we take it for granted that that's just something that happens on the internet today. But it's very hard to move that into a 3D virtual space because those platforms don't interoperate in the same way today.
I think that's a fascinating point, Jamie. Sorry, Sue, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I guess, with my legal hat on, I think the interoperability question is really interesting. And what, the technical folk will tell me is that from a user perspective, completely understand why they want that ability. From a technical perspective, pretty difficult to achieve at the moment, but people are working on it. But I come from the basis that at the moment the interoperability that exists, that the challenges are not just technical, but they're also legal and commercial. And if you want, at the moment at least, to be able to use a virtual asset from one platform to another, there may be restrictions from a legal perspective to do that, because the platform doesn't want you to bring something, or there are sort of guardrails around that. So a lot of our clients who are looking at doing sort of metaverse activations or any kind of project in this space, they have to think about who are the current stakeholders that they would need to contract with, or whose terms do they need to review to make sure that they can do what they want to do in that platform. And that's sort of a big sort of exercise for them to think about in the future if it's more decentralized. They're just other issues particularly for companies that want to engage in the metaverse, what that means for their brand, what that means for their sort of intellectual property and liability issues. So there's lots of, I think, issues around interoperability that are beyond the technical, and they're beyond the kind of user take up. There are also sort of these questions around legal, contractual, kind of more run-of-the-mill issues that companies need to think about.
Compared to that, the technical side is going to be pretty easy, I think.
The question of IP ownership is a huge issue, and especially of the transition from one, like you say, from one thing to another. You're actually transferring ownership and data from one database or from one platform to a number where other people have access to this. And of course, how do you protect that especially in a decentralized world where literally anybody, the whole point is that anybody can access and anybody can build upon. How do you protect your IP? How do you protect even your sovereign data from a brand perspective? When it was an interesting comment when you say, I don't want my item coming into another person's world. Well, what if I bring a pair of Adidas into Nike land? I'm going to get completely derided for it, or maybe I get kicked out because it's impossible.
But I can wear a pair of Adidas shoes into the Nike store in London today. So,
yeah.
It's if you want that physical virtual world to be as familiar as possible, I should be able to do that.
I think there's also the question of, and we might come on to it later, around safety, so consumer safety, as well as sort of data privacy issues, where you may not want certain users on your site, and others may not want users on your site. So you might be quite happy for a child, for example, to enter a particular metaverse walled garden, but are you happy to take, if you've created a world that's really for sort of 18 plus, how do you prevent someone be able to move from site to site? Are you going to have pop-ups saying, show me your credit card details to prove you're over 18, for example, otherwise you're not allowed in. You're not allowed to bring your beer from one site to another because of, there's regulatory issues around, health, medicine and cigarettes. What if you bring a cigarette into a platform? So there's lots of interesting, I think, issues about how we might as users want to take our stuff wherever we want. But the companies that create that stuff, or the real life version of that stuff, they may not want us to use the digital version of that stuff in a particular place. And so I can see a sort of proliferation of different metaverses, maybe for different demographics and different use cases. But it will be interesting for every individual company that wants to participate in the metaverse. Where do they want to participate, and how do they stop, as you say, Theo, other people misappropriating their goods, or sort of passing off their goods as theirs, especially in a decentralized world where it may be very hard to pinpoint who do I complain to take that down. It's not like going to OpenSea or one of the social media sites where you kind of know who to complain to.
Thanks, Sue. I think you've raised some brilliant points there, which hopefully we can get into a little bit further on in the panel. We've had some really great questions also come in on the chat function, so thank you those for submitting questions. And one kind of related to the conversation we're having right now is from Chris Silberberg, and he asks, obviously you might not have a full answer to this today, but Chris asks, how will we start to see the issues with interoperability be overcome? Will it be through ecosystems of allied organizations independently coming together, or will it be more of a standards and regulatory body that may enable this? A bit of a tough question there, Chris, but Theo, can I go to you to at least attempt to answer that?
It's interesting. I wrote a few years ago, actually, I had a look at the IoT landscape. And what I see in every single tech shift is the same thing, which is in IoT, there was something like 10 standards bodies that came up and basically said, we want to be the standards body and define standards for IoT and interoperability between devices and things like that. Of those, I think there were some major organizations all pitching into one particular one. So you had Microsoft, you had Google, you had all the big centralized players basically say, we want to be the main standards body that will define the way forward, etc. And then you have, so basically you have 10 different bodies all trying to be the one standard, all defining their own thing, all having very closed working group meetings and not really talking to each other. And I kind of see the same things happening all over again. It's just a pattern, a repeating pattern where now the metaverse and the Web3 is such a big opportunity that you're going to have lots and lots of different bodies springing up overnight and working groups all wanting to be the person or be the group that defines what the standard is going to be, what the technical code is going to be, whether it's going to be WebAssembly or something else entirely different. What the transport mechanisms are going to be for interoperability, what brands are going to have to adhere to, how to treat IP, data privacy, etc. So I think we've got about 10 years worth of pain, unfortunately, ahead of us before we even get even close to an agreement. And then the likelihood is our definition of metaverse and Web3 is going to evolve in those 10 years as well. So whether we get to a point where we have the evolution and the final stake in the ground of what we want this thing to be, and it matches what the standards need to be, is anyone's guess.
Sorry, Chris, I think it's 10 years of pain that might be coming your way before we get to the bottom of that. But our Chris, IBM, I'd love to come to you on another question that got put in the chat as well. So we've talked a lot around these interconnected spaces and connected ecosystems, and some of the challenges we're going to have in making sure that there's movement between all of them. For people who might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed by this conversation, can you offer any simple advice to start familiarizing how companies can start familiarizing themselves with these connected spaces and what they need to do at this point to get prepared? And this links to a question that we had right at the beginning from Tarek, who asks, what are the tools, languages, and techniques that people should start to familiarize themselves with the metaverse?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So the first thing I would say is this is all probably a little bit overwhelming to everyone. So I speak to customers every day on this, and they're just like, oh my goodness, right? Metaverse, that's so far off, and it's not, right? It's something that's sort of evolving today. And the thing that I would start saying to everyone, and this is the advice that I give, is think about the existing digital architecture and IT strategy that you have today, right? Almost everybody is moving towards a headless omni-channel architecture. And I said that a little bit at the beginning, right? So, we've had this evolution from web to mobile phones to, contact centers, et cetera, right? And if you start to think about this as an extension of your existing IT strategy, and think about how you would want to start having presence in these worlds, right? Whether it's a Decentraland, Sandbox, Horizons, whatever, right? Or whether you want to build your own experiences, start to think about how that is going to plug into your existing digital platforms as well. What do I mean by that? So let's take an example like a Decentraland. It's a pretty good example. So let's say I set up a virtual bank branch or a virtual retail store. And then I go and meet customers where they are, right? And so you go have a conversation with them, etc. That's nice. Maybe you've got a shop, you sell some goods, or maybe you're doing some sort of advice. Well, if I've had a conversation there, have a think about this for a second. I don't want that to be a siloed experience, right? Yeah, I assume you maybe got a CRM system, right? Whether it's a Salesforce, an SAP, etc., or one of the other ones. Maybe you've got a content management system, right? Maybe you've got a commerce platform where you take orders. If you're taking orders in a completely separate platform, then you're not joining that up. You're having siloed experiences. You're missing opportunities to have conversations with customers where they are and build up a richer view of your customer and be able to do interesting things. So I would, to center that back on the question, the thing that I would be doing there is really focusing on that omni-channel, thinking about being able to have APIs that can interact with different channels, and then look at the various platforms that maybe align with your customers and think about where they are, and then you can start to build experiences within that. But if you build these siloed experiences, it's not going to help you. Now, the second thing I would say is be aware of your brand and what is going to be good and what is going to be damaging. So a lot of people will be interested in the NFT hype, for example. And I saw a question about IPFS, which is an interesting one, but I'm happy to get into later. Similar sort of thing. NFTs could be really powerful for your loyalty strategy, right? That could be something that's hooked into your APIs to be able to give you access to exclusive content, to give bonuses, etc. But if you see it as something where, you know what I want to do is extract some money out of my customers really quickly, you're going to do brand damage, right? And therefore, who you associate with, what the purpose of that is going to be, could actually be more damaging than beneficial. So it's about having that organized strategy, but bringing your existing architecture along with you on that journey so that you evolve into these platforms. Make sense?
I think that does make sense, Chris. Thank you so much. Jamie, I know this is something that you do work on. So is there anything else that you want to add on that?
I mean, yeah, if we consider consumer metaverses aside for a second, right, and consumer experiences from an enterprise and industrial point of view, we can build interconnected 3D worlds today, and we're doing a lot of that, right? We're the work that we've been doing with BMW, with Siemens, with Ericsson, with IKEA, with Volvo, right? Brands that are now realizing that in order to realize that consumer and customer engagement end goal, they have to go right back to the start. The assets and the way that they're building their digital products, and that could be something that eventually does get manufactured physically, of course, like a car, but to take right at the start and building those cars, designing those cars in a way that allows them to move through the entire chain of digital when that car exists digitally in the same format with interoperable, open tools like materials, shaders, lighting, means that it allows you to create everything downstream of that CAD designed, that engineered vehicle much easier, because you are not having to make huge amounts of changes and pay huge amounts of money to move things between different spaces. It's exactly, the example that Chris gave about the, Ray-Bans. Right? If you want to be able to take that same pair of glasses into lots of different spaces, you have to go back to Luxottica, who make Ray-Bans, and have them design their sunglasses in a way that can be interoperated between lots of different 3D spaces. And it's the same in the industrial metaverse landscape that we work in primarily. We're hugely focused on USD as one of those standards for interoperating 3D content, which, back to that question about what people should be looking into, USD is emerging as the HTML of 3D. So if you imagine today you're uploading a JPEG as your 2D profile picture, we see in the future you're more than likely going to be uploading a USD representation of a 3D asset, because it will allow the interchange between different industrial spaces. The advantage that business enterprises and industrial complexes have today over the consumer land is that there's a lot more immediate financial incentive and economical incentive to build large digital twins of things like warehousing, right? What we're doing with Amazon logistics and robotics right now to completely simulate the entire world of Amazon supply chain will bring them massive amounts of advantage when it comes to improving the logistics and quality of what they're doing. So we're going to see that all happen first, and it kind of has to happen first, because in order to have digital assets and digital worlds that we can push out to consumers, all the content created for those worlds needs to be built in an industrial or enterprise type metaverse first to get there. And fortunately, we don't have to work through a lot of the same consumer litigation and ethical and legal things to just build the content creation ecosystem. And by the time that's done, we're hoping that great people like Sue will have helped that world figured out how it's going to deal with those issues that are, far too complex for me to comment on today.
I was going to say maybe that's because I think one of the questions come through about use cases, and that's the other, I think the important part is that, at least our experience as lawyers, is that obviously the most sort of furthest along the journey around their exploration of the metaverse are the tech companies, the gaming platforms, and the consumer companies. They've started to kind of play in this space, but actually there's a lot of companies that are a little bit further behind, but very interested in how they extend what they've already been doing in the manufacturing and the healthcare and the energy space around the use of technologies like AR, VR, digital twins, to say, you know, how could we use metaverse like platforms for R&D, for training, you know, particularly around like healthcare, like immersive training of reps in terms of use of products and services. So those I think those applications are also really interesting. And as you say, Jamie, they throw up issues like intellectual property and liability issues. But, you know, if it's industrial, data privacy is not going to be one of your key concerns. It's going to be more about trade secrets and making sure that, you know, who's allowed to join that platform, so that you make sure that your IP is protected. So really interesting use cases. I think they're obviously I think the headlines at the moment are around the kind of consumer space, because that's, you know, journalists are users, we're all users. But I think some of the behind the scenes applications are really interesting.
So I was just going to add to that. I mean, we do a lot of work with, you know, in industrial platforms around things like oil rigs, for example, or, you know, bridges, etc., where you go in and you have to go and find what the physical faults are. And of course, they're today done with 3D models, etc. So all the work that you're investing in 3D models, and that's one of the things I would say companies should be investing in today, start building out the 3D models, whether in a consumer or industrial space. But then, as you see, the natural extension of that is to take those 3D models, which you tend to run in a mobile platform today, and move that into a virtual space, and that's already sort of happening. And of course, if you think about the cost of an oil rig, right, and you think to yourself, you know, there's danger associated with that. Even just to get on an oil rig, you have to go through basically a drowning test. You essentially are dunked in the ocean or whatever, and it costs, and then you get transferred across from a helicopter. So if you think of all the costs involved, right, to go and do something on an oil rig, being able to bring that out into a digital twin, be able to represent that as 3D models, you know, huge use cases that, you know, that we're already kind of working on there.
I'd much rather do that safety training in a virtual world than a physical world, that's for sure. But I think it's true, right, that there are examples of exactly how we defined metaverse at the top of this call. There are examples of it happening today in the industrial world, in enterprises. You know, exactly how we expect it to be at a much bigger scale in the consumer space. It is happening now, interconnected 3D worlds, interconnected 3D tools. And, you know, a lot of the capabilities of that comes from the visual effects industry. It's why we're hiring a huge amount of people who help build, you know, the amazing 3D tools that people use to create visual effects content, to help us build the next generation of digital twin platforms, of autonomous vehicle platforms. And it's there now. You can go and do it, and people are. But it's that step to the consumer world that's the really difficult one. I think lots of people talking about, here's our metaverse experience today. Are they really metaverse experiences, or is it using that word for something that we've been doing in platforms like EVE Online, World of Warcraft, Second Life for nearly a decade, just with slightly better graphics?
Or not.
Well.
I just want to come in there and say that was a fascinating discussion about the different use cases across consumer and enterprise, and how we're already starting to see that what we might define the metaverse as already in industry. But Jamie, I just want to push down on something that you said there around the technologies which are already available today, such as AR, VR, and digital twins. But some of the technologies that the metaverse are going to depend on, they're not at that point yet. Can you maybe explain to the audience what kind of technologies we're almost kind of waiting on, what we're going to need for the metaverse?
The big one, in my opinion, is 5G, 6, and then 6G networking. In order to realize the fidelity level that consumers will expect as an uplift from what they can do today, in order to move the amount of data needed around the world from any point, you know, be it a in-store, be it a mobile phone, a tablet, whatever, We need those networks to be realized. 5G is not realized yet at all. It's pretty far away still. We're seeing lots of POCs and examples of how you can deliver very high quality XR experiences from cloud or from an edge data center to a consumer device or an in-store experience or a billboard. But they are POCs still. The 5G networking, certainly in this country, and we're at techUK, so I'm going to specifically talk more about this country than other places who are a bit further ahead than us. We don't have all of the amazing things that 5G is promising, such as bandwidth slicing to enable something, really high bandwidth for a single event, or high bandwidth for a certain company or organization to split off to deliver a specific experience. That's a big thing. And then, the computing power. We have major CSP presence, all based in North America and APAC, which is great. And, our friends at IBM have amazing cloud technologies that allow us to deliver these things from great data centers. But some of the time they aren't close enough to the consumers and the users to deliver what will be expected, again, in a higher fidelity, higher quality consumer experience. So we're going to see the telecommunications world and the content delivery network world, who are used to delivering 2D content to our screens. They're the people who deliver all your television or your Netflix or your iPlayer, moving into the requiring to have AI, AR, XR tools in their edge data centers, which is the ones that sit closest to you, closest to your phone, your TV, your shop, and your billboards. To enable the quality of content that brands are going to expect from this. Like Theo, made a comment there about some of these things aren't as high quality even as those games were a long time ago. It's true, and it's in part because in order to deliver these things at massive scale, the economics aren't there yet because the compute isn't widely available at the high enough quality that it needs to be on the consumer side. I'd say as well, the networking stuff and the data bandwidth is the most important thing for the digital twin space of metaverses as well in the industrial complex, in order to send all of the data from every camera, every CCTV camera, every sensor across, say, the entire rail network in the UK, is tens of thousands of pieces of information constantly being streamed. Now, at the moment, they're all sent into a little DVR, and then if there's an issue or someone needs to watch something, it gets sent to British Transport Police, and it takes them 6 days to figure out how to get it out of that proprietary DVR format and into a system that can be used. The next generation of that has to be feeding all of that data into a digital representation of whether it be a rail network or whether it be a factory or something like that, in order to have a real-time digital twin of that location. So network is key.
Thanks, Jamie. You've caused a lot of questions to come in on the chat there, which is absolutely no, that's absolutely brilliant. It shows that what you said is really engaging with the audience there. Apologies to those who are sending questions into the chat. There's so many that are coming through, which is so fascinating. If we don't get to them today, I will make sure that they are all recorded so we can either send them across to the panelists, or we can do more events on these particular topics that are coming up. But I wanted to just go to a topic which is coming up time and time again in the chat, and I want to go to Theo on this. We're hearing a lot of conversation here about the theme of decentralization, and obviously related to decentralization is DLT technologies. Can we maybe take a step back and talk about what the role of this technology is going to be in the metaverse, and then also maybe touch on some of the high level implications that we might be seeing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I actually looked into the decentralized side of Web3 a couple of weeks ago, and just try to encapsulate how many tools there are. So I'm a firm believer in there's going to be a mix. It's going to be like Web 2.5 for a very long time. There's going to be a mix of everything is being built on obviously Web 2 because that's what infrastructure is there just now, and then we'll be using sort of open source software to augment that as much as possible and give control and demote a little add that element of decentralization before we make that full transition. And it's taken 30 years to get to where we are today. It's probably going to take another 20, 30 years to fully realize what Web3 is. So, whenever we see lots of great headlines, it's not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen next year. So we need to be a bit patient for one. On the decentralization side of things, again, like I said, big open source advocate, and I actually had a look at what in the gaming, just in the purely in the gaming sphere, what exists out there, because everybody looks at Fortnite, well, Unreal and Unity as the only two options that are available to build anything in terms of what the metaverse can be realized as. And there are about between 5 to 10 different open source engines that are comparable to Unity or Unreal. There are a whole raft of open source and decentralized physics engines, not to mention the same in terms of graphics tools, interoperability tool, or not interoperability tools, but tools that allow you to connect different different worlds together, data pipeline, etc., etc. So there, for me, decentralization starts with a bit more education into what alternatives are available to some of the big players out there. And then we can start to build out that decentralized network of open source tools that allow people to create using these platforms, extend what other developers have done. Hence, open source is basically allow invite more developers in who actually want to add Web3 functionality and Metaverse functionality to the existing tools, because they were all built for Web2. So let's start building and let's start inviting all those developers in who are building applications in Web3 to start augmenting what open source has already started. So there's a lot of work still to do for me, but I think the vast majority of it, I think, starts in terms of decentralization, is starting to understand what open source alternatives exist that we can build on.
Fascinating. Thank you, Theo. I want to go to Sue on some of the social, legal, and ethical questions that have been raised. But just quickly before I do that, Jamie or Chris, anything else that you want to add around the theme of decentralization?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. I was just going to add on to what Theo was saying there, and I totally agree with the open source kind of gaming thing. And one of the things I would say of stuff that people could do today is, as you look at that evolution, right, to Web3 and what Theo was saying about lots of open source gaming engines, I personally think that open source gaming engines will form part of your digital architecture and enterprise architecture today. And the reason I say that is there's a lot of concepts that you need to understand, like where a person is in an experience. There's going to be and a lot of these gaming engines have that built in already, right? They've got the low latency technology, using WebSockets to do authoritative game services. That's built in. Technologies such as leaderboards, technologies such as tracking what is considered as your game state, but think of game state not as game state, but as in world state, right? Then if you then start to combine that with your other technologies, so I think things like Colesis, things like Nakama, etc., are technologies that are probably going to rebrand themselves at some point. I'm not telling them their strategy, but I would say that as people move into these worlds, then those technologies are going to become more important. And then similar for the actual gaming experiences, lots of open source game engines, physics engines, as he was saying. And therefore, as you're going to start to build these new experiences, then they're going to be as important as technologies, web frameworks like React, Angular, etc., where you build experiences today. You're going to start to build these richer, more immersive experiences. So that's something that people could kind of get started. And what I would say on the centralization, and I'll be controversial, I worry, right? Which is, I'm a big fan of decentralization, and somebody mentioned IPFS, which is I absolutely love, and I do think that and hope that will be a technology that will really sort of push decentralization for file storage. But then I worry that what happens to that point about Web 2.5, then big tech will essentially platformize that, right? Because you get into this world where somebody's going to have to host your content. Somebody's going to have the node up and running, right? And you've seen something like IPFS, Pinata stepped into that role. Do I expect a Google, etc., Amazon, etc., to jump in and start offering those services? Absolutely. So the risk in this decentralization is, although that everybody's open, there's a risk that the platforms end up dominating the space anyway and sort of push people out. So I think that's just something we all need to be aware of as well, because we don't end up in a sort of Web 2 scenario again.
Yeah, I think if you look at how a lot of those open source formats today for the web and for 3D are managed and ran, it is by large companies. right? If you look at the Kronos Group, if you look at the Volumetric Format Association, these are mostly run by groups of companies with vested interests in having these platforms and tools as open as possible, but ran well. It'll be the same with USD. USD at the moment is relatively, open and developed by lots of different groups at the same time, who end up with slightly different versions of USD to do slightly different things. We're all aiming to have a single branch of a format that allows us to interchange 3D data. But at the moment, there's NVIDIA's USD, there's Epic's USD, there's Autodesk's, and there's the one that Pixar use internally. We absolutely want to contribute to that all being right and done very well. But if you end up with 1,000 different open source standards, nothing will interoperate at that point. So there's a balancing act, which I think the web at the moment is doing quite well. I think, groups like Kronos do great work. It could always be improved upon, but it's that balancing act between having things work on every website and having nothing work, but having 1,000 different things.
Thank you so much, Jamie. We are very quickly running out of time, and I want to make sure I can go to Sue to talk about some of the questions that have been justifiably raised in the chat around some of the social, legal, and ethical implications of the metaverse. Now, Sue, I'm very aware this could be an entire panel in itself, and we only have a couple of minutes. But some of the themes that have been raised, we've already touched on, so IP ownership, online harms, digital inclusion. But I kind of just want to go to you on what do you think some of the main legal and ethical implications that are going to emerge over the coming years, and what businesses and people need to be aware of?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a huge topic, and obviously it depends where you're coming from. Are you a creator of one of these platforms? Are you providing services that form part of a platform? Are you a user, sort of enterprise user of a platform? Lots of things to think about. I think some of the key themes are, data protection. What's clear in the metaverse is more and more data is going to be collected about users and new types of data, because the technology is going to allow us to, figure out how Laura's eye gaze works in a particular platform, how she interacts with others. You might have an identity that's supplemental or different to your offline persona. And obviously some of these things are true at the moment, but it's just going to be much more of an issue, particularly if you have this interoperability, where how do you ensure compliance with data protection rules without introducing a lot of friction into the user experience if you've got lots of different organizations wanting to collect and use data about an individual. So there's a lot of focus on that and identity and what that really means in the future. I think going on from that big topic around online safety, we know that particularly in gaming, harassment in virtual spaces is not new, especially for certain for women and minorities and other individuals. So that's going to be a massive issue, and child safety in particular is a key focus. IP, certainly, how do you protect yourself? How do you prevent others, including fans of yours, using or misusing your brand? Now, again, these are, this is sort of a new evolution. These issues, again, not entirely new, right? We've got experience, including from platforms like Second Life. So there is some case law, there is some precedent, and none of these things operate in a vacuum. Provided you are operating particularly in a centralized way, and it's clear that there's an organization responsible, the existing laws apply. So it's trying to figure out, what you're going to be responsible for. What do you need to think about when you're developing your metaverse strategy? And I think continued focus on responsible and ethical approach to tech development for the sector, and how, if you can build in privacy by design and consumer protection by design as much as possible, that's going to be really key. I think the other thing is, there's a lot of talk about ESG, and how any initiative in this space lines up with your sort of stated principles around sustainability, and how you can, make sure that those principles do not conflict if we are moving to more and more, consumption of energy via increasing how we use technology. So I think there's an awful lot for people to think about. I think a lot of the time, based on where we currently are, it's using existing best practices and sort of analogous experiences to figure out what you really need to think about. But I think it's key that it's part of your strategy right from the beginning, that you're bringing in, you know, the relevant stakeholders across your enterprise to make sure that you're thinking about this in the right way and that you don't get tripped up later, which will be much more difficult to unpick than if you'd brought people on right from the beginning to think about the kinds of issues that might crop up that you need to be aware of. And as sort of, I think, you know, Chris said, it's not just what does the law say, but it's about, you know, reputation and what implications there could be if you're not considered to be, you know, acting in a responsible way as we continue to move towards this new kind of world that we're seeing for both consumers and for business generally.
Thank you, Sue. I know that's a hefty topic to try and address in just a couple of minutes, so I think you did a fantastic job there. I guess from my perspective, because the technology is moving so quickly and it's evolving so quickly, what you're saying is looking at what best practice we already have and focusing on the values which might extend across rather than the technology. Is that fundamental to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Generally, we don't regulate technology. I mean, there are some exceptions. What we do is we regulate, you know, for either to encourage good behavior or to avoid harm. And so it may be that we will have laws in the future that are more specific, but, you know, we haven't had up to now laws in AI. Law is always playing catch up. I think as much as possible, industry will always say if we can come up with solutions to avoid regulation so that we are doing things responsibly, that's better. I think the area where it's going to just become much more complicated is if it becomes a very decentralized future, and then we're into all sorts of more complex issues around, you know, what laws apply, where are companies even based, or is there even a company, or is there a DAO at the middle, and we're not even sure what that means legally in different countries. So it's the more centralized it remains, the more straightforward it is. The more decentralized, the more complicated for everybody to navigate that legal side of the expansion of this technology.
Thank you, Sue. So we're getting very, very close to the end, and I want to give all our panelists the opportunity to kind of round up some of the most important points. So my final question to all four of you here today is, what opportunity are you most excited about that the metaverse will unlock? And please feel free to take this into any direction that you would, with the key messages that you would like to leave our audience with today. I was a bit mean to Theo in the beginning by going to him first, so I'll go to him last, and I'll pick on Chris instead, if that's okay.
So I think it's super exciting, right? And I think we only need to look at the last couple of years where we've all been locked up behind, you know, our screens, you know, to realize that we've got new type of screens we can lock ourselves behind. No, I'm kidding. You know, but but actually, serious point. I mean, if you haven't used a virtual reality headset today, and had a meeting or a collaboration in something like Horizon's Workrooms or Spatial or something like that, go do it, because actually although you've got a sort of cartoon representation of yourself, right? It's a proper experience. Somebody feels close to you. You can have glances. It feels like a proper interaction. And I remember, you know, having sort of spent so much time on Teams, etc., just being able to have those experiences, you know, was refreshing. So that in itself is exciting, but just simple things like that ability to connect people together. We had a meeting recently where we had, you know, 50 different people from all countries across the world in different scenarios, and we were all there together in the same environment. So the opportunity, I think, for everyone is to have a more connected space, right, where both that physical and digital world to be able to do more and interesting things. You know, I think the opportunities in that sense are endless, you know, and it's up to us to make it a good space, a nice space, and something that is, you know, but I'm hoping that it's a world that we can sort of balance the economies a little bit, and then balance the workforce, and just make a more inclusive place, right? So I hope we don't get it wrong, but that for me is the massive opportunity, and I think and I really just want to say to everybody, right? I have conversations like twice a day at the moment on this topic. Every company is thinking about their strategy into the metaverse. So it's not something to be sitting thinking, you know, I'm going to give it a few years and worry about it then. It's something you need to start thinking about what your place is, what you can do to make experiences better, whether for your customers, for your own employees, or you know, or wider. So I would say start thinking about it now.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you so much for joining us here today. Jamie, can I go to you next for your final points?
Two things. So from an industrial and enterprise point of view, massive potential economic benefits and sustainability points to be made around, if I can simulate everything I'm going to do in a physical space before I go and build a factory, design a car, break ground on anything, as an example, build a new energy plant, I can simulate it to be the most efficient it could possibly be, to make sure that it's going to be in the right place, to make sure that the people that are going to interact in that space are treated, and that space is designed around them and around the robots that will interact in that space as well, allows you to make it the best it can be. And it also allows you to fix any mistakes that, more often than not, when you're in that sort of industrial complex or enterprise world, you end up spending a lot of money afterwards and a lot more energy to rebuild something or to fix something in those sort of environments. And that goes for many different manufacturers of lots of different products, right? Even people who build very basic things. You know, we're doing a project at the moment with a large advertising group and well-known brand around accessibility in product design. At the moment, if I want to make this cup as easy to hold as possible for as many people, you go through lots of physical prototyping and focus group work, which is all still going to be very important. But if I can simulate this cup physically accurately across many different types of environments with many different types of grip strengths, as an example, I will know the best way to build a product for many people, which leads me on to the accessibility side, because there was a question that was asked, I think, right near the start of this that I want to mention. Today, if I want the best quality fidelity experience on my computer, my phone, my tablet, I need a very expensive thing in my hand or in my pocket. And that was the point that I think Duncan was making, right? Is that today we exclude a lot of people because the quality of computing needed physically in front of you is quite high. One of the goals of this whole conversation is to completely move that expense from your pocket to people like IBM, to people like, you know, the other cloud providers. I won't name them because Chris is on the call, I'll be polite. And to the telco providers, right? We saw yesterday that EE in the UK have signed an agreement with Nreal, who make amazing AR glasses. So you can see in the future that a contract with EE on a 5G or 6G network would include AR glasses with the computing requirement driven from a central location. So the access to the higher fidelity content in a metaverse scenario should actually become more accessible, because you aren't expected to make an upfront investment in a highly powered computing device. We're doing this right now in cloud gaming, right? We put millions and billions of dollars into centralized computing capability for cloud gaming, and then people can play the sort of games that you'd need a $5,000-$6,000 dollar PC for on a much cheaper monthly payment on their phone or on their TV at home. So accessibility is a big thing that I'm excited about for this.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for bringing that important topic around inclusion and accessibility up at the end. And it's definitely something we need to consider going forward with techUK's conversations around the metaverse. I know we are overrunning ever so slightly. So Sue, can I go to you for your final remarks?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you've stolen my thunder, because I've got an elderly mother and a disabled sister, and I was saying, you know, for all the enterprise benefits, if we can build a metaverse future which makes it easier for older people, for single people, for people with disabilities to meet, travel, work in an augmented way that they would not be able to physically, I think that will be fantastic. And I also see real benefits for training, education, you know, sharing knowledge between countries, and helping perhaps some of the poorer nations with healthcare and other things that they need to achieve locally. I think that's fantastic. But as we say, you know, there's risks, and I think we have to make sure that if we're building this new, you know, whether we call it Web 3.0 or this future world, that we learn the best examples of what we've had over the last 20 plus years, and we avoid the worst. And so I think there is a whole conversation about building the right tech, but there is still, I think, a big conversation about how we as individuals engage online, and we're going to have to fix that, because otherwise we're just going to take the problems we've had into a bigger, more complex environment going forward.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you so much for joining us here today. Last but certainly not least, Theo.
What am I really excited about? And in fact, I'm going to pick up on what Oliver Bennett has actually put in the chat, actually, which is I'm really excited about the economic side of things. I know it's like a boring topic, but it's the economics of allowing people to create in the metaverse and across Web3 and own what they create and be able to make a living out of that. I mean, I see future generations as their work and their play is actually going to be merged into the metaverse, where that is their playground and that is their work. They will make a living out of that and a sustainable income to the point where they might not actually contribute to the real economy because they're contributing to the virtual economy. And I think Jamie's CEO actually said that he expects the virtual economy to be, NVIDIA's CEO to be the actually bigger than the real world economy. I can see this transition happening where they both feed into each other. What happens in the physical world will impact what happens in the real world, in the virtual world, even from an economic point of view. But I think we really need to sort of do a couple of things. One is I actually wrote about this on LinkedIn a couple of hours ago, which is we need to do a lot more education. And I think it sort of touches on Sue's point, which is who are the people that we're building this for? Because we're not really talking to them. We're kind of talking in this panel, even in this panel, we're all talking to our peers. We're all talking amongst ourselves, but it's actually the end people that we're not talking to directly to say, this is what we're building. Is it what you want us to build for a start? And then what are the tools that are going to allow them to actually build upon what we build? So we're building the foundations. Don't expect it to be the end goal. I expect the people in the street to be able to take advantage of this and build their online, their online lives into a more immersive virtual presence, make money out of it, collaborate, connect with people in completely different ways. So I think the economic side of things is really interesting for me, but I think we've got a lot of bridge building to do with the people that we're actually building all of this for to get there.
Thank you so much, Theo, and thank you so much for joining us here today. What fantastic panelists we've had on this discussion. I've been in awe with all the really great topics and insight that you have offered. But if those final remarks have taught us anything, is that this panel could have gone in so many different directions. So today we've already talked about what the definitions of the metaverse might take. We've talked about the importance of interoperability and how we can move our Ray-Bans or our BMWs through these connected worlds. Ironically, I always give the examples of Louboutins, which is ironic because I don't own any in real life anyway. But we talk about the different ways that we need to be able to start doing this. And then Jamie came in and talked amazingly about the enterprise examples and how this is already starting to be driven at an industrial level. And then finally, we've talked about discussing the absolute unknowns that we don't know what's going to happen about the metaverse. And if that teaches us anything, is that this is not just a one panel conversation at techUK. This is something that we are going to be continuing doing and something we will be driving forward. Thank you so much to all of our attendees for sticking around. I know we've gone over ever so slightly, but just to say, if you are interested in learning anything more about techUK or the work that we will be doing on the metaverse or future technologies, please do not hesitate to get in touch. And once again, thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. It's been a pleasure having you here, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.